Okay, I'm Marie Nugent. I am Public Engagement Manager for the College of Life Sciences here at the University of Leicester. I can not really keep up with my own thoughts, to be honest. I think about all sorts of things. I probably overthink, a little bit guilty of overthinking. And it could be anything from what should I have for lunch today, to how am I going to juggle all of these things for my job? What am I going to do this evening? I think I ask myself a lot of questions, I think overthinking for me is a good thing, but it can very easily become a bad thing. And you can get stuck in sort of a cycle of overthinking and perpetuating something before it's even happened. So my dad is a really good example of overthinking and maybe it going a bit too far sometimes, because he's a lorry driver. So he spends a lot of time in the car or in the lorry, driving all day, and it gives him a chance to sort of overthink things sometimes. So before he's even had a conversation with someone about something, he's gone through all of it in his head before it's even started. So yeah, I think it's always good to question yourself and question what you're doing and why and all that sort of thing. That's how I like to think things through. But yeah, too much overthinking is definitely a bad thing. I'm a bit all or nothing, so I'm either frantic with all sorts of things whizzing through, barely able to keep up, like I said, or I'm like completely empty-headed, or I'm completely sort of zen and relaxed, and I find it hard to find that in between sort of space, actually. Yeah, I think it has. I think it's shifted definitely from, I went to an all-girls school, so, being a teenage girl and it all being about these little things about what other people might think of you and, oh, if I wear that, will people say this and this sort of rubbish. I definitely don't care about that sort of stuff. Sometimes I want to make a bit of an effort and look nice, but it nowhere near dominates my thoughts as it did when I was a teenage girl. And I think I've become much more relaxed and I suppose just it comes with confidence and age really, and like life experience and sort of going, well, that's not really important. And so my mindset has changed in terms of maybe how I look at myself, and I've become more relaxed about sort of being more comfortable in my own skin.
Okay.
There are certain people, I find it quite difficult to engage with or kind of know how to read someone if they are, they seem quite blinkered and sort of single track minded. So I suppose this makes me sound really bad, but I kind of rely on being able to sort of convince people of things and, influence someone to be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Like, why don't we go and do this? Oh yeah, that sounds really good fun. And, I ask a lot of questions about things just because I'm very curious, I suppose. And it's just what I've been trained to do, I suppose, in terms of how I think. I ask lots of questions. So I find it really hard to work with or engage with or be with people that seem to have a very black and white view of the world, because to me everything's grey. So I think my training made me, my training being that I've done a PhD, so I've been trained to think very logically, critically, in terms of like research. So I suppose if anything, what I've realised now I've stepped away from research and I've moved more into like communications and engagement work, that I think naturally I probably wasn't really like that, and that my training has kind of trained me to think another way away from my own natural way of thinking actually. And now I've stepped away from research itself that I'm kind of realising this. I think I was could have quite easily gone down a sort of more like English, like maybe even arts kind of sort of course, or education sort of wise, but I ended up sort of choosing science, and I think that's had a big impact on how I think about things. But like I said, I've moved away from research itself now, and I look at science through a slightly different lens, and I feel much more comfortable with that way of thinking. I didn't realise it until I stepped away. I think in terms of science, I think in terms of the scientific process, if you like, I think it's very useful for there to be some training in that way of thinking. But like me, if you find that actually your way of working doesn't really fit that, and actually you're much more comfortable and much more creative, or you're much more productive generally if you have a bit of a different way of approaching things, then great. But I think to even be aware that there's like a particular way in which people are trained to think in order to do something like science or research is very useful. It only, if anything, just make you appreciate what that process is like. But then that's my opinion. So I would say a lot of my friends are fellow sciencey people, whether they have chosen to then leave science after that study or not. And then in terms of sort of secondary school sort of level, my friends were so the other way that even though I hadn't had the training yet, I was still the kind of fairly logical one. So I had quite sort of comfortably wacky, secondary school friends. But in terms of, through, because my secondary school as well is where I did my A-levels as well, so I just stayed on with the same people. So it's only really then going to university, studying biomedical science and genetics, that I then was kind of completely surrounded by people who were clearly of a very similar mindset. But again, you don't really realise that. Like I was saying, I think that what you choose to study has a huge influence on how you then think. And it's only really when you then do something different that you realise that. Like I was saying for myself earlier, moving away from research itself and looking at it through a different lens has made me realise that only fairly recently, actually. So I'm a big believer in sort of being self-aware. I think it's quite easy to sort of get caught up in the pace of work, pace of life generally, and you don't often, I don't often take the time to actually reflect. I know it's a bit of a corporate buzzword now, but a bit of reflection I think is always really useful. So I've been looking at how I found my first year in this particular role that I'm doing now at the university. Because it's a new role, it's quite a challenging role. It's probably, the most I've been stretched in terms of like my capabilities, if you like, in a good way, I mean that. So, and it's been really hard work. So I needed to kind of, over Christmas, do nothing for a good few days and actually try and look back over this huge learning curve of my first year in this like new exciting job. And now I work with a mixture of a real eclectic mix of people, from artists to very kind of focused fundamental researchers, and just talking to these various different people has made me realise myself how I've switched, or how I am maybe moving away, and kind of finding my own way of looking at things that's probably somewhere in between the two, but I haven't quite figured it out yet.